Hey, it's Josh Levine from Zero to Piano. In this video, I'm going to talk to you about human skill acquisition. In the last few decades, scientists have been making some very interesting discoveries in this area. They're studying world-class athletes, chess players, musicians, other skilled performers. They're trying to identify what exactly makes them really good at what they do. Is it genetic? Is it something they've done? Was it in their environment growing up? What's their secret? I've done a lot of reading about this myself. It's an amazing topic, and I'm going to provide a list of recommended readings so you can check it out if you're interested. But today I want to touch on a couple of big points that I've learned. First, it turns out that what we think about as natural talent is actually a myth. There is no such thing as a genetic predisposition for any particular skill. There may be a genetic predisposition for skill development and specialization, but no one is born an amazing piano player or a computer science prodigy. Second, we have a pretty good idea about what actually happens inside your brain when you develop skills. And there are some things that you can do to make those things happen faster. You can think of them as brain hacks, but most of these things are common sense if you really think about it. In the rapid skill acquisition literature, the brain hacks are all lumped together in what scientists are calling deliberate practice. If you want to acquire a skill as fast as possible, you must engage in a routine of deliberate practice, which should have the following three components: isolation, deliberateness, and consistency. In this short series of videos, I'm going to break each of these down for you. Okay, so we're going to begin with isolation. Most things that we think of as skills are actually amalgamations of sub-skills that we can break down, deconstruct, and tackle individually. Let's take the skill of cooking, for example. To be a good cook, you have to have great knife skills, great shopping skills like knowing your ingredients, preparation skills, and presentation skills. Probably each of those things can be broken down into even smaller sub-skills beyond that. Tim Ferriss is big on this idea. He calls it deconstruction, and he talks about it at length in his book, The 4-Hour Chef, which I highly recommend. So for example, if you're a baker and your apple pies keep coming out lumpy and you identify that it's because your apple slices aren't consistently thick, which I don't really know if that's a thing, just roll with me on this one, you could approach the problem in a couple different ways. One way to approach the problem is to keep going through the whole process of making apple pies, and when you get to the apple slicing part, really concentrate and hope you get it right. You might improve by doing this, but you also might make a lot of lumpy pies and waste a lot of time. But what if, after you identified that apple slicing was the problem, you spent 10 minutes per day for 3 days in a row just slicing apples with the specific intention of learning how to slice more consistently? You'd probably be a much better apple slicer after that, and you'll have solved the lumpy pie problem. Bottom line is this: you get better at what you practice. A lot of piano players sit down and play an entire piece, and they mess up a couple times here and there. But instead of going back and isolating the problem areas, really focusing on just those moments, they play through the entire piece all the way through again with the hope that they can smooth over those problem spots if they just concentrate a little bit harder when they come up. What they don't realize is that if they just isolated the problem spots and worked on them one at a time, separate from the whole piece, when they come up in the context of a piece, they'll have already smoothed it over. A frequently asked question about this is, how much should I isolate? It's a great question. The short answer is that you should zoom in on something that if you really focus, you can experience a significant improvement on in the space of about 5 to 8 minutes. There's a whole range of things that this could be. It could be practicing a short sequence of notes, like a scale or a lick that your hands feel clumsy on right now. It could be a two-handed rhythmic coordination thing over a couple measures. It could just mean moving your hand back and forth between two chord positions that are giving you trouble. The 5 to 8 minutes length of time is important, and I like it for two reasons. First, it requires you to choose something small. If you don't experience a significant improvement in a focused 5 to 8 minutes, you didn't choose something small enough. Second, it kind of almost tricks you into using every ounce of concentration that you have. Since you know it's only going to take 5 to 8 minutes, you can find it in you somewhere to focus, go slowly, and be patient. Piano players resist doing this for a variety of reasons. Maybe they feel more musically satisfied by playing through bigger sections instead of practicing little phrases. Or maybe they don't think it's that fun to keep repeating little passages that they're not very good at. That's why when most people sit down at the piano, they play something that they already know how to play. But if you're interested in expanding, zooming in and mastering little problem areas is by far the most efficient way to get better. What would it be like to cultivate a loving relationship with this aspect of practicing? There's a fantastic online drumming instructor named Mike Johnston who calls this embracing the suck. I love Mike Johnston for coming up with this phrase. Embrace the suck. It's about leaning into your weaknesses and solving problems. It's about loving the things that you're bad at and grappling with them. If you can fall in love with that, you're guaranteed to improve. Plus, you'll actually enjoy the process along the way. Practicing with deliberateness means practicing with purpose. A lot of this comes from isolation. You've isolated the skill and you practice specifically to improve that thing. Another part of practicing deliberately is eliminating distractions so that 100% of your attention is on your practice. No cell phones, no Facebook, just you and the tasks. Once you've done that, a successful practice session is all about what I'm going to call reaching in the sweet spot. What do I mean by that? Reaching beyond your ability is almost exactly what the word practice means. The big question is, how far do you reach? In his book, The Little Book of Talent, which is, by the way, a fantastic book, and I totally recommend checking it out if you have the time, Daniel Coyle develops a concept called the sweet spot. I love the way he talks about it. I'm paraphrasing him here, but the general idea is this. If you imagine a spectrum of challenges that go from very easy to very hard. A task below this dotted line is so easy that when you try it, you're successful at least 80% of the time. Feels like a cakewalk, like you could do it in your sleep. This is the section of ease and effortlessness, and Daniel Coyle calls it the comfort zone. A task above this dotted line is so hard that when you try it, you're unsuccessful most of the time. Tasks in this range feel cumbersome and impossible. Coyle calls this the survival zone. Coyle describes this as the zone of confusion and desperation. The tasks are just too hard. You thrash, you scramble, you guess, and if you do succeed, it's mostly out of luck and not an indicator of progress. But between the two lines, tasks are challenging, even frustrating at times, but totally engaging. They require all of your attention, and when you try them, you are successful enough times to give you the rewarding feeling of accomplishing something, like little wins along the way. Coyle calls this the sweet spot. When you're here, you're engaged in an intense struggle, reaching and grappling for success, tasting it every once in a while. When you make mistakes, you're hyper aware, diagnosing your errors, trying again. When you succeed, it feels great. This is where you want to spend most of your time practicing. If the tasks are too easy, you slide down here into the comfort zone and you don't make much progress and possibly get bored. If the tasks are too hard, you get exasperated. Both are demotivating. But if you practice right at the edge of your ability, not only is it more effective in terms of skill development, it's also inherently more motivating and rewarding. The famous psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi has a different visual representation of the same concept that might be helpful. His research deals with happiness and creativity, and a very special state of mind that he calls flow. He describes it as a state of total unself-conscious involvement in an activity. And in his book, Flow, which also I highly recommend, fantastic book, he draws a graphic out like this. On this axis, you have your challenges ranging from very low to very high. And on this axis, you have your skills also ranging from very low to very high. Let's say you're a beginning basketball player and your coach tells you that for the next 5 minutes, you're going to practice shooting the ball into the hoop from about 5 feet away. Since you're a beginner, the challenge is about a match with your skill level. You're probably about here with your skill and about here with your challenge, and so we are here. In this section of the graph, Csikszentmihalyi calls it the flow channel. Pardon me, the flow channel. You can almost think of the flow channel as the sweet spot lane. When you're in the flow channel, you're engaged, trying to improve, and enjoying yourself. But let's say that after a week of practices, your coach tells you to keep shooting from 5 feet away. At this point, you'll have moved into this section of the graph, the section of boredom, aka the comfort zone. You move to the right because your skill is improved, but the challenge hasn't risen to meet where you are. So of course, you're going to slide over here and get bored. But what if a different thing happens? What if your coach asks you to play one-on-one against the best player of the team? That would put you in this section of the graph, the section of anxiety, aka the survival zone. Your skill level hasn't risen enough to deal with the new intense challenge, and you're outmatched. Since you don't have the skill to meet your opponent, the mismatch makes you anxious. Either state, boredom or anxiety, is demotivating. If you're one of them, you have two choices. You could quit and fall off the graph altogether, or you could try to move back into the flow channel by recalibrating the challenge to match your new skill level. Maybe you find an opponent who's about your same skill level or perhaps just slightly better than you. In other words, you find your new sweet spot. So if your sweet spot started here, now you're at a higher skill level and a higher challenge, and your sweet spot is here. These models are great, but a big question that always comes up for me is this: how do you really know where your sweet spot is? Both models, Coyle's and Csikszentmihalyi's, have descriptions of how their different zones feel, and those should be your main indicators. But I'm going to add one more thing that I think is essential: honesty. You have to be honest with your self-assessment. If you're shooting a basketball, but you're practicing shooting from half court, and every time you shoot, you're way off, you're out of the sweet spot. You might be having a lot of fun, but you're probably not being quite honest with yourself about where your skill level actually is. If you really want to get better at shooting, you might consider moving closer. Maybe practicing free throws until you get into a rhythm. After a few successful free throw attempts, then you can move a bit farther away and then a bit further, staying in the flow channel by increasing the challenge along with your rising skill level. If you're practicing a musical passage, but you're doing it quickly and your fingers are hitting wrong keys and struggling to keep time, you're not in the sweet spot. If you keep doing what you're doing, you run the risk of developing bad habits and actually reinforcing the mistakes that you're making instead of working to iron them out. So if every time you practice, you make the same mistakes without addressing them, you're not being honest with yourself about how skilled you actually are, and if you're not careful, it could do some damage. You might be asking, what's the pianistic equivalent of moving closer to the basket when you're practicing shooting? And the answer is something that makes a lot of piano students kind of uncomfortable. It's this: practice more slowly. The Meadowmount School of Music, which I think is in Vermont, has been churning out an unbelievable number of world-class violinists, cellists, and piano players since the 1940s. And one of their teachers famously says to her students, if someone walking by can recognize the piece that you're practicing, you are not practicing slowly enough. In other words, you should be practicing so slowly that the piece is not even recognizable anymore. This is a powerful example. The teacher recognizes the physical reality of developing fine motor skill. When you first practice a piece, playing through it at performance tempo is normally way past your sweet spot. Performance tempo is a challenge up here and requires this amount of skill. But you're still down here at your skill level. Slowing the piece down reduces the challenge to meet your skill level. It brings it back down so that it meets you in the middle at your sweet spot, inside the flow channel. As your skill improves, you can increase the challenge by increasing the tempo, moving your sweet spot up through the flow channel, like so that eventually you can reach a point where you can play whatever piece you're working on even faster than performance tempo. At that point, playing the piece at performance tempo is actually in your comfort zone, and you can do it in your sleep. There isn't a single lick or scale or piece of music that can't be broken down and mastered in this exact way. That's the beauty of deliberate practice. From a neurobiology perspective, the two most important ingredients for skill development are regular practice and sleep. Before you develop a skill, the neural pathways required for that skill are kind of like bumpy roads in your brain. It's hard for neurons to drive on those bumpy roads, which is why being a beginner is so frustrating and hard. Doing something repetitively tells your brain to go send a construction crew down there to make the roads smoother. And the more consistently you do it, the more your brain tells the construction crews to hurry up. This might seem like a funny analogy, but it's closer to the truth than you might think. When you fire a neural pathway, your brain produces a substance called myelin, which forms an insulating sheath around the neural pathway, like this. It makes it smoother and faster. The more you fire that pathway, the more myelin wraps around it. It turns the bumpy roads in your brain into smooth highways that neurons can fly through. When you sleep, your brain produces even more myelin. It's like your brain hires a nighttime construction crew, and when you wake up, all of a sudden, the street has been totally repaved. I have personally had a direct experience with this hundreds of times. I'll practice something at night, like a lick, and I just won't quite have it, and I'll go to sleep disappointed. But then when I wake up in the morning, whatever I was struggling with is somehow magically easier. And the next day, it's even easier, until one day I wake up and it's effortless. This is the power of sleep. One kind of downside about this is that you really can't cram for the piano. It's a motor skill, and so it takes time. If you're working on something tough, you probably need some consistent practicing and a few good nights of sleep before you really get the motions into your fingers. But the upside is that once you've got it, you got it. Once the road is paved, it doesn't unpave. It might get a little dusty if you don't drive on it for a while, but it's still a good road. That's why the phrase, "it's like riding a bike," exists. Once myelin wraps around a neural pathway, it doesn't unwrap. So, that's why consistency, repetition, and sleep is the magic formula for developing proficiency at literally anything. It simply cannot be done faster or more effectively in any other way. The trouble with consistency, though, is that it's very hard to keep yourself motivated to do something. That's why it's important to have a couple things in mind when you create your routine. In the first place, know what your end goal is. In his book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, Stephen Covey spends an entire chapter talking about beginning with the end in mind. It's super important because if you're trying to tackle a long-term task, if you don't have a clear sense of where you're going and why it's important to you, it's very easy to fall off the path. And number 2, it should be fun. This is a big one. If you think about your practice as a bunch of drills, it can feel boring and obligatory, like eating your vegetables. You might still do it, but somewhere inside you're probably thinking, I know it's good for me, but man, this really sucks. Instead, try to frame your practice sessions as fun, addictive mini games. Like, how many times can I play through the short passage correctly? Can I do it 5 times in a row? Can I do it 6 times in a row? Can I do it 7 times in a row even? If you can do it more times in a row today than you did yesterday, it's like a little win, and that feels good. That's what will make you want to keep coming back for more. All right, we're done. Quick recap. We talked about deconstructing big skills into their component sub-skills. That's isolation. We talked about practicing deliberately and reaching in the sweet spot or the flow channel. And we talked about how important it is to keep a consistent routine over time. If you can follow these 3 suggestions, literally any skill you want, especially playing piano, is in your reach.